The Wuhan Cover-Up. This video is based on key insights from the book The Wuhan Cover-Up by Robert Kennedy Jr. Introduction. Robert Kennedy Jr. begins by recalling a pivotal moment in American history, his 7th birthday coinciding with President Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961. Eisenhower warned the nation about the growing power of the military-industrial complex, not just the army and weapons makers, but also the influence of powerful scientists and medical researchers working for the government. Kennedy Jr. explains that Eisenhower specifically worried these scientists could threaten freedom and democracy if they became too powerful. He believed America couldn't be a strong world power and still protect freedoms at home. The author argues that this warning came true, and a powerful group, a cartel, formed blending government, science, the military, and big businesses. Kennedy Jr. points to Dr. Anthony Fauci as someone who rose to the top of this system over 50 years, helping to increase the power and profits of this group. He believes this cartel reached its peak during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it used its power to take away rights, control information, and push people to get vaccines. Kennedy Jr. contends that this isn't a new problem. He references the work of sociologist C. Wright Mills, who in the 1950s described a permanent war economy that thrived on creating fear and anxiety. This constant state of worry, the author suggests, allowed the military and related industries to grow and maintain control. His uncle, President John F. Kennedy, understood this danger and fought against it, particularly with the CIA, believing it had become too powerful and was working with corporations for its own benefit. Kennedy Jr. shares that his uncle even wanted to break up the CIA because he felt it was acting against American interests. The author then connects this history to the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. He claims that the Biosecurity agenda, a plan for preparing for and responding to pandemics, became the new focus of the military-industrial complex after the Cold War. Kennedy Jr. asserts that the CIA and Pentagon secretly practiced responses to pandemics through simulations, preparing for authoritarian measures that would limit freedoms. He alleges that these simulations were not about protecting people, but about controlling them. Kennedy Jr. makes a strong claim that Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates were public faces of the pandemic response, but were actually working for a larger, hidden group within the CIA and Pentagon. He believes this group was involved in creating the COVID-19 virus in a lab in China, deciding how to respond to the pandemic, and covering up the truth about where the virus came from. He states that revealing the truth about the virus's origins would expose the corruption and the people involved, which is why it's being hidden. The author believes this hidden group benefits from creating and releasing viruses, then profiting from the response. Part 1. The Road to Wuhan. Robert Kennedy Jr. begins by asserting that figures like Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci weren't just predicting a pandemic, but seemed to know it was coming, preparing for it for years through warnings and funding. Kennedy argues this foresight wasn't luck, but connected to a long history of secretive government bioweapons research. He suggests these individuals weren't simply preparing for a natural disaster, but potentially facilitating one. The author details a troubling history of the U.S. government's involvement with biological warfare, starting after World War II. Instead of rejecting the dangerous science used by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the U.S. actively recruited scientists involved in horrific experiments. These scientists brought with them not just knowledge, but a willingness to disregard ethical boundaries. Kennedy emphasizes that this marked a turning point, embedding a dangerous mindset within U.S. scientific and military circles. He points out that the U.S. uniquely refused to sign international agreements banning biological weapons, keeping its options open. Kennedy explains that the focus shifted to gain-of-function research, intentionally making viruses more dangerous and easily spread. He argues this research, funded by agencies like the NIH and directed by figures like Fauci, was incredibly risky. The author contends that this wasn't about preparing for pandemics, but about creating the potential for them. He highlights the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a key location for this research, funded in part by U.S. grants funneled through organizations like EcoHealth Alliance. The author details how the U.S. government, through figures like Fauci and organizations like BARDA, invested heavily in Moderna, a company with no proven track record, betting on a pandemic occurring. This investment, Kennedy argues, was not simply about public health, but about creating a market for a specific solution, mRNA vaccines, and suppressing alternative treatments. He suggests a deliberate effort to control the narrative around the pandemic and profit from the crisis. Kennedy points to a series of pandemic simulations, like Event 201, as evidence of pre-planning. These exercises, involving government officials, intelligence agencies, and industry leaders, weren't about preparing for a crisis, but about practicing a response that would increase control and suppress dissent. He argues these simulations laid the groundwork for the policies implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic, including censorship of information and the push for mandatory vaccination. The author emphasizes the role of intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, in funding and directing this research. He suggests the CIA saw bioweapons as a way to expand its power and influence, and that the pandemic was a manufactured crisis designed to achieve those goals. Kennedy connects this to a broader pattern of government secrecy and manipulation, arguing that the public has been deliberately misled about the true nature of the threat. Kennedy concludes by highlighting the disturbing parallels between the U.S. bioweapons program and the unethical experiments conducted by Japan and Germany during World War II. He suggests that the pursuit of bioweapons has corrupted the medical profession, turning it into a tool of control rather than a force for healing. He believes understanding this history is crucial to preventing future crises and protecting democratic values. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a hidden history of the United States' involvement with biological and chemical weapons, beginning in World War II and continuing for decades afterward. He argues that the government has consistently lied about the extent of its programs, and that these programs have grown, especially in dangerous areas like gain-of-function research, making viruses more harmful. The story starts with the U.S. quickly realizing Japan was using biological weapons during the war, and instead of being horrified, American scientists and universities saw an opportunity. In 1941, the U.S. government asked leading scientists from places like Harvard and Johns Hopkins to study if the U.S. could also make biological weapons. They enthusiastically said yes, even suggesting terrible ways to harm people, like poisoning milk or spreading diseases in public places. The universities weren't just giving advice, they were paid handsomely to research dangerous germs. This created a strong link between science, money, and the military that continues today, with research funding now heavily reliant on government contracts. Kennedy Jr. suggests this reliance played a role in the response to COVID-19. The U.S. didn't just start from scratch. Shockingly, after World War II, the U.S. actively recruited Japanese scientists from Unit 731, a notorious group that performed horrific experiments on people. The Soviets were also trying to get these scientists, so the U.S. promised immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research. Shiro Ishii, the leader of Unit 731, initially faked his own death to avoid capture, but was eventually found by U.S. intelligence. He shared his research, including data from thousands of autopsies, and the U.S. used it to build its own bioweapons program at Fort Detrick. Kennedy Jr. emphasizes the U.S. knowingly protected war criminals to advance its own weapons development. This pattern continued after the war with Operation Paperclip, where the U.S. brought over 1,600 German scientists, many with Nazi backgrounds, to work on U.S. weapons programs. The CIA was heavily involved, even helping scientists escape justice for their war crimes. Scientists like Kurt Blohm, who had worked for Hermann Göring and recommended the murder of people, were brought to the U.S. and given important positions. The author points out that the U.S. prioritized getting scientific information over holding these individuals accountable for their actions. Kennedy Jr. argues that this secrecy and willingness to work with unethical scientists created a culture that continues to this day. He suggests this history is relevant to understanding the origins of COVID-19 and the policies surrounding it, implying a continued pattern of deception and dangerous research. The author highlights that the U.S. built its bioweapons program on stolen research and protected those responsible for terrible crimes, all in the name of national security. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a troubling history of the United States government's involvement with biological warfare, revealing a decades-long pattern of secrecy and questionable ethics. From the 1930s onward, the U.S. relied heavily on pharmaceutical companies, intelligence agencies, and the military to develop dangerous toxins, often with little regard for moral boundaries. The author points to the origins of this partnership in the work of scientists like Dr. Gerhard Schrader, who created nerve gases for the Nazis, and the subsequent recruitment of these individuals after World War II. Even companies like Bayer, with its dark past in producing Zyklon B for Nazi death camps, were welcomed into the fold, transforming their knowledge of chemical weapons into profitable products. Kennedy Jr. explains how Fort Detrick, Maryland, became the central hub for this activity, working closely with public health agencies like the NIH and CDC. He argues that these agencies, while seemingly focused on health, were deeply entangled with military interests from the start. The government provided significant funding for research into infectious diseases, blurring the lines between defensive and offensive bioweapons development. A key figure in this story is Anthony Fauci, who began his career at NIAID in 1968, and who, according to Kennedy Jr., prioritized industry profits and military applications over public health. The author emphasizes a disturbing trend: the willingness of scientists to compromise their ethics in the name of national security. He draws parallels between the actions of scientists like Ishii in Japan and Schreiber in Germany, who conducted horrific experiments, and the behavior of those involved in the U.S. bioweapons program. Kennedy Jr. contends that this pursuit of bioweapons inevitably leads to a disregard for human life and a willingness to engage in unethical experimentation. He highlights instances of the U.S. military conducting secret experiments on its own soldiers, and even on unsuspecting civilian populations, testing pathogens and chemicals without their knowledge or consent. Kennedy Jr. details how the CIA became heavily involved, adopting Nazi techniques and conducting covert operations to test biological agents on American citizens. These included spraying bacteria over cities like San Francisco and New York, and releasing disease-carrying insects in various locations. The author points out the consistent pattern of secrecy surrounding these activities, making oversight and accountability nearly impossible. He argues that this secrecy, combined with a lack of ethical restraint among scientists, created a dangerous environment where questionable research flourished. The narrative then focuses on the escalation of bioweapons development, particularly the focus on gain-of-function, research, manipulating pathogens to make them more dangerous. Kennedy Jr. explains how scientists began to engineer drug-resistant strains of diseases and to explore ways to weaponize insects and other vectors for spreading pathogens. He suggests that this research was driven by a desire to create more effective bioweapons, and that it often involved unethical experimentation. The author also notes the close relationship between the bioweapons program and psychological warfare, with the CIA exploring ways to control human behavior through drugs, toxins, and other methods. Kennedy Jr. asserts that the U.S. government has repeatedly violated international agreements and ethical principles in its pursuit of bioweapons. He cites accusations of using biological weapons during the Korean War and details allegations of attacks against Cuba in the 1960s and 70s, involving diseases like Newcastle disease and African swine fever. While the U.S. officially denied these accusations, Kennedy Jr. presents evidence suggesting that these attacks did occur, and that the government actively covered them up. He concludes by expressing concern that the moral failings and lack of accountability within the bioweapons community continue to pose a threat today. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a disturbing history of the U.S. government's involvement with chemical and biological weapons, arguing it's been marked by deception and a relentless pursuit of increasingly dangerous technologies. He asserts that while publicly condemning such weapons, the U.S. actively developed and deployed them, even against its own citizens. In the 1960s, the military used Vietnam as a testing ground for chemicals like napalm and Agent Orange, while simultaneously acknowledging to Congress they were building biological weapons. The U.S. resisted international efforts to ban these weapons, claiming loopholes for gases and herbicides. Kennedy Jr. focuses on Agent Orange, a herbicide containing dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known. He explains that the U.S. sprayed over 5.5 million acres of Vietnam with these chemicals, causing immense suffering, hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of disabilities among Vietnamese citizens, and a similarly high toll among American veterans. Shockingly, he alleges the military first tested Agent Orange on prisoners at a Philadelphia prison to study its effects, knowing it was likely carcinogenic. He accuses officials at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, of covering up the link between Agent Orange and cancer in veterans, delaying benefits for years until exposed by his uncle, Senator Edward Kennedy. He further claims this same CDC official was later promoted to a position overseeing research into childhood neurological disorders, suggesting a pattern of concealing harmful truths. The author highlights internal opposition within the military itself. Kennedy Jr. notes that some strategists worried these weapons were too easily created and spread, potentially falling into the wrong hands and being used against the U.S. They feared the boomerang effect, the possibility of the weapons being turned back on American forces or civilians. Experts warned that biological weapons were unpredictable and could trigger global pandemics. Despite these concerns, the U.S. continued research, even developing vaccines alongside the weapons themselves, recognizing the need for protection against potential blowback. Kennedy Jr. describes President Nixon's surprising decision in 1969 to end the U.S. biowarfare program, citing both moral and strategic reasons. Nixon believed biological weapons were too dangerous and uncontrollable. He also wanted to prevent other countries from acquiring similar weapons, maintaining U.S. dominance. This led to the Biological Weapons Convention, BWC, in 1975, an international treaty banning the development and stockpiling of biological weapons. However, Kennedy Jr. implies that despite the treaty, the underlying research and dangerous practices didn't truly end, setting the stage for future concerns about gain-of-function research and potential pandemics. He points to David France, a former commander at Fort Detrick, who later became involved in programs that would contribute to the COVID-19 pandemic, suggesting a continuation of risky bioweapons-related work. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a troubling history of secret bioweapons research and deception by the U.S. government, stretching back decades. He argues that the official story about America's commitment to banning biological weapons is a lie, revealing a long-running, hidden program that has exploited loopholes and ignored international agreements. The author explains that the Biological Weapons Convention, meant to stop the creation of these weapons, has a major flaw. It allows research on dangerous germs if the work is claimed to be for peaceful purposes, like developing vaccines. Kennedy Jr. points out that this dual-use loophole has been widely abused, allowing bioweapons development to hide in plain sight. The narrative highlights how, even after President Nixon supposedly banned U.S. bioweapons in 1969, the CIA continued its secret experiments, even hiding deadly toxins in warehouses. Kennedy Jr. describes a plan by the CIA to secretly collect and store dangerous pathogens from the Army's bioweapons lab before it was dismantled, showcasing a clear intention to maintain a bioweapons capability. He emphasizes that the U.S. has consistently blocked efforts to strengthen the Biological Weapons Convention with inspections and enforcement, essentially giving a free pass to nations willing to break the rules. Kennedy Jr. explains that the Reagan administration, fueled by a group of aggressive policymakers, secretly revived the U.S. bioweapons program in the 1980s. The government began funding research at universities, claiming it was for defensive purposes, but in reality, it was developing offensive biological weapons under the guise of vaccine research. The author details how the Pentagon poured money into genetic engineering projects, aiming to create superbugs resistant to vaccines and even race-specific bioweapons. This period saw a dramatic increase in funding for bioweapons-related research, with universities eagerly accepting money despite ethical concerns. The author connects this clandestine activity to real-world events, like the Iran-Iraq War, where the U.S. secretly provided Saddam Hussein with biological weapons materials. Kennedy Jr. argues that this support ultimately backfired, potentially contributing to health problems among U.S. troops during the First Gulf War, who were then subjected to experimental vaccines. He points to evidence suggesting that soldiers developed mysterious illnesses linked to altered microbes possibly used in bioweapons research. Kennedy Jr. stresses that vaccines, while often beneficial, have become deeply intertwined with bioweapons development. He explains that military strategists have always understood that a vaccine is essential to protect troops from a bioweapons blowback, the risk of the weapon harming its own side. This creates a perverse incentive to develop both the weapon and the vaccine simultaneously. The author also notes that weakening a population's immune system makes them more vulnerable to biological attacks, and that the U.S. military has explored ways to achieve this. The author concludes by warning that the pursuit of bioweapons, masked by claims of defense and vaccine development, poses a grave threat. He suggests that the U.S. government's actions have not deterred other nations from developing bioweapons, and that the lack of oversight and enforcement creates a dangerous situation where these weapons could be used with devastating consequences. Kennedy Jr. believes that the close relationship between military funding, scientific research, and public health agencies has created a system where ethical concerns are often ignored in the pursuit of bioweapons capabilities. Part 2: Gain-of-Function Research and the Rise of the Biosecurity Era. Robert Kennedy Jr. details how, following the Cold War, instead of enjoying a peace dividend, money saved from military spending, a group of powerful people in the U.S. government and related industries saw an opportunity to keep the money flowing. They feared losing their influence and income, so they began planning for a new kind of threat: biological weapons and engineered diseases. This marked the beginning of what Kennedy Jr. calls the biosecurity agenda. The 2001 anthrax attacks, while tragic, became a turning point. Kennedy Jr. argues these attacks weren't just a random act of terror, but were used to scare the public and justify a massive increase in spending on biodefense. He suggests the attacks were conveniently timed after a simulation called Dark Winter, which predicted a similar scenario, and that key figures like Vice President Dick Cheney and his team were already laying the groundwork for a shift in focus towards biological threats. This shift allowed them to funnel money into research and development, particularly within the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and under the direction of Dr. Anthony Fauci. Kennedy Jr. explains how the U.S. government began secretly funding dangerous research called gain-of-function. This involves altering viruses to make them more contagious or deadly, supposedly to prepare for potential outbreaks. However, he argues this research is incredibly risky, as it could accidentally create a pandemic. He points to experiments funded by Dr. Fauci, like one where scientists modified a coronavirus to jump between species, as evidence of this dangerous practice. The author contends that this research was essentially a revival of bioweapons development, disguised as public health protection. The Patriot Act, passed quickly after 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, played a crucial role. Kennedy Jr. asserts this law stripped away important privacy rights and gave the government broad powers to surveil citizens, all under the guise of national security. He also highlights how the act weakened regulations around biological weapons research, effectively opening the door for more dangerous experiments. The author suggests that the government used fear to push through laws that would normally be met with resistance. Kennedy Jr. details how Dr. Fauci skillfully positioned himself at the center of this new biodefense world. He received a significant raise and gained control over a vast amount of funding, allowing him to build new high-security labs and fund research across the country. The author claims Fauci created a system where transparency was limited and dissenting voices were silenced. He suggests Fauci's focus shifted from simply preventing infectious diseases to actively researching and manipulating them, blurring the lines between public health and bioweapons development. The author explains how the government created loopholes and used vague language in laws to justify these actions. He points to the Project BioShield Act and the 21st Century Cures Act as examples of legislation that expanded government power and shielded companies from liability, even when things went wrong. Kennedy Jr. argues that these laws were designed to benefit the pharmaceutical industry and the military-industrial complex, at the expense of public safety and constitutional rights. Kennedy Jr. emphasizes that the National Academies of Sciences, NAS, briefly attempted to rein in Dr. Fauci's activities, raising concerns about the risks of gain-of-function research. However, he claims Fauci was able to manipulate the system, silencing critics and ultimately continuing his controversial experiments. The author suggests that Fauci's influence and control over funding allowed him to overcome opposition and push forward with his agenda, despite warnings from scientists and lawmakers. Ultimately, Kennedy Jr. paints a picture of a decades-long deception, where the U.S. government has been secretly developing biological weapons under the guise of protecting the public. He argues that the COVID-19 pandemic was a direct result of this dangerous research, and that the biosecurity agenda is a threat to freedom and democracy. He believes the public has been misled, and that it's crucial to expose the truth about what has been happening behind closed doors. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a troubling story of hidden dangers and questionable decisions made by people in power. He argues that for decades, the U.S. government has been misleading the public while secretly increasing dangerous research into bioweapons and gain-of-function, experiments work that makes viruses more deadly or easily spread. The narrative begins with a series of lab accidents in 2014 involving dangerous viruses like bird flu, anthrax, and even smallpox, which triggered some concern but were quickly covered up. Kennedy Jr. explains that Dr. Fauci, a key figure in the U.S. health system, reacted to this criticism by firing members of a safety board who questioned his approach to funding risky research. He then replaced them with people who were more likely to agree with him. This allowed the dangerous research to continue largely unchecked. A group of concerned scientists formed their own independent group, the Cambridge Working Group, to warn President Obama about the risks, and Obama briefly paused funding for this type of research. However, Kennedy Jr. asserts that this pause was largely ignored. Scientists who received government funding, like Ralph Barrick, protested, arguing that the research was necessary for developing defenses against future outbreaks. Barrick, heavily funded by Dr. Fauci, continued his work even during the pause, manipulating viruses in a lab. Kennedy Jr. claims that the NIH, under Fauci and Collins, found ways to get around the rules and continued funding these projects, claiming they were vital for national security. The author details how the Obama administration ultimately handed control of the review process to the very people who were invested in the research, the NIH, effectively ending any real oversight. He points to a contractor, Griffon Scientific, with close ties to intelligence agencies, being hired to assess the risks, and predictably concluding that the benefits outweighed the dangers. Kennedy Jr. suggests this was a predetermined outcome. Kennedy Jr. then focuses on Peter Daszak, a scientist who became a key player in funneling U.S. government money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. Daszak's organization, EcoHealth Alliance, received millions of dollars from various U.S. agencies, including the NIH, USAID, and the Department of Defense. Kennedy Jr. argues that EcoHealth served as a way to hide the U.S. government's involvement in risky gain-of-function research happening in China. He suggests that Daszak actively promoted this research, seeking funding from multiple sources and downplaying the risks. The author emphasizes that this funding wasn't just about scientific research. It was also connected to military and intelligence interests. He claims that agencies like DARPA and the CIA were involved, using EcoHealth as a way to support bioweapons development in China. Kennedy Jr. paints a picture of a complex web of connections between U.S. government officials, scientists, and Chinese labs, all working on dangerous research with little public scrutiny. He concludes that the U.S. government knowingly funded and enabled the kind of research that could potentially lead to a pandemic, prioritizing secrecy and political agendas over public safety. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a troubling history of hidden dangers and questionable decisions made by governments and scientists, particularly concerning the development of dangerous viruses and the cover-ups surrounding their origins. He argues that for decades, the U.S. government has been less than truthful about the risks associated with biological research, specifically gain-of-function research, which involves making viruses more dangerous to study them. This research, initially slowed by a temporary pause called a moratorium under President Obama, actually flourished because of funding, channeled through organizations like EcoHealth Alliance to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. Kennedy Jr. claims this funding continued despite the moratorium, raising serious questions about oversight and the true intentions behind the research. The author points to a pattern of accidents and escapes from biolabs throughout history, suggesting that the risk of a pandemic originating from a lab is far from insignificant. He cites examples like the origin of Lyme disease, potentially stemming from a U.S. Army lab, and the spread of RSV from a research facility. These incidents, combined with numerous documented leaks and safety breaches in labs worldwide, paint a picture of a system prone to error and potentially catastrophic consequences. Kennedy Jr. emphasizes that these aren't just hypothetical scenarios. They've happened before and continue to happen. Kennedy Jr. challenges the widely accepted idea that most pandemics originate from natural animal-to-human jumps. He contends that this narrative is pushed by those with a vested interest in continuing dangerous research, and that a significant number of outbreaks have actually been linked to laboratory incidents or vaccine development. He highlights the lack of transparency surrounding these events, with governments and institutions often covering up mistakes and downplaying risks. He points to instances like the SV40 contamination of polio vaccines and the potential link between lab accidents and the Ebola pandemic as evidence of this pattern. The narrative then shifts to China's rise as a major player in biomedical research, fueled by a deliberate strategy to overcome past scientific shortcomings. Kennedy Jr. argues that China actively sought to infiltrate U.S. labs and acquire knowledge, and that this ambition was coupled with a willingness to operate with less transparency and accountability. He details how China strategically gained influence over Western scientific journals, like The Lancet, through funding and partnerships, effectively turning them into platforms for propaganda and suppressing dissenting voices. Kennedy Jr. is particularly critical of The Lancet's editor, accusing him of prioritizing relationships with China over scientific integrity and of publishing flawed studies that supported China's narrative during the COVID-19 pandemic. He alleges that the journal actively worked to discredit effective early treatments and promote remedies with financial ties to powerful interests. The author suggests that this manipulation of scientific information was a deliberate attempt to control the narrative and profit from the crisis. Ultimately, Kennedy Jr. presents a compelling case that the pursuit of bioweapons research and gain-of-function experiments, combined with a lack of oversight, a culture of secrecy, and the increasing influence of foreign powers, has created a dangerous situation with potentially devastating consequences for global health. He argues that the risks far outweigh any potential benefits, and that a fundamental shift in priorities and transparency is urgently needed. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a troubling story of how, for over 40 years, China has been working to get technology from the United States, especially in areas that could be used for weapons. It began in the 1970s when China sent students to the U.S. to learn about Western technology, with the goal of bringing that knowledge back home. This wasn't just about everyday technology. It was a deliberate plan to catch up with the West in important fields, including potentially dangerous ones. Programs like the 100 Talents Program and the 1,000 Talents Program actively encouraged Chinese scientists and researchers to study in the U.S. and then return to China, often with valuable information. The author argues that U.S. universities became easy targets for China, and that the U.S. government didn't do enough to protect important research. Kennedy Jr. points to a large number of Chinese students studying in the U.S., around 350,000, many of whom have access to cutting-edge science funded by American taxpayers. He claims China wasn't just relying on students, but also actively trying to get American scientists to work for them, offering money and rewards for intellectual property. The FBI has even arrested people, like a professor at the University of Texas and the chairman of Harvard's chemistry department, for stealing technology for China. Kennedy Jr. focuses heavily on the role of gain-of-function research, which involves making viruses more dangerous to study them. He asserts that the U.S. government, particularly through Dr. Anthony Fauci and the National Institutes of Health (NIH), funded this type of research and then, incredibly, helped transfer it to China. He suggests that Fauci knowingly funded scientists with ties to the Chinese military, and that this funding helped China develop its bioweapons capabilities. He highlights Emory University as an example, where NIH funding supported research that ultimately benefited Chinese scientists linked to biowarfare. The author emphasizes that China isn't shy about its intentions. He points to a 2015 Chinese military manual that openly discusses using genetically engineered viruses as weapons, detailing how to make them more effective and how to spread them. This manual, Kennedy Jr. argues, shows that China views gain-of-function research as a key part of its military strategy. He contrasts this openness with what he sees as a lack of transparency from U.S. officials like Fauci, who he claims downplayed the risks of this research and its potential for misuse. Kennedy Jr. details how Ralph Barrick, a scientist at the University of North Carolina, received over $230 million in NIH funding and shared his expertise in engineering viruses with Chinese researchers. He alleges that Barrick even patented technologies that could be used in vaccines and treatments developed from these engineered viruses, potentially profiting from a pandemic he helped create. The author suggests that this situation represents a dangerous conflict of interest and a betrayal of public trust. He believes the U.S. government has been naive, or worse, complicit, in allowing China to build up its bioweapons capabilities, and that this poses a serious threat to national security. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a troubling history of hidden activities by the U.S. government, particularly concerning bioweapons research and the manipulation of viruses. He argues that, for decades, the government has not been honest with the public about these dangerous practices. It began after the anthrax attacks, when a lot of money started flowing into research on dangerous germs. This led to the creation of high-security labs, like the Galveston National Laboratory, which Kennedy Jr. claims became centers for risky, gain-of-function research, essentially making viruses more dangerous to study them. The author points to Dr. Anthony Fauci as a key figure in this story, accusing him of actively supporting and funding this research, even collaborating with scientists in China, including the infamous Batwoman of Wuhan. Kennedy Jr. alleges that Fauci helped China build its own high-security labs, potentially giving them the ability to develop bioweapons. He describes the Galveston lab as a place where scientists were essentially looking for ways to weaponize diseases, a claim supported by legal expert Francis Boyle, who believes the lab should be shut down. Kennedy Jr. highlights a pattern of secrecy and questionable partnerships. He explains how USAID, the U.S. agency meant to provide aid, has a long history of being used by the CIA for covert operations. He argues that USAID has been a tool for promoting U.S. interests, even if it means supporting questionable regimes or engaging in risky research. He specifically points to the Global Virome Project, a privately funded effort to collect viruses from around the world, as a potentially dangerous scheme driven by profit and a desire for control. The author suggests that the focus on collecting and manipulating viruses isn't about preventing pandemics, but about creating a market for vaccines and other biodefense products. He details how scientists like Dennis Carroll allegedly misused government funds to launch this private venture, raising concerns about conflicts of interest and a lack of transparency. Kennedy Jr. emphasizes that experts are questioning the value of this research, arguing that it's a waste of money and could actually increase the risk of pandemics. Throughout the chapter, Kennedy Jr. paints a picture of a powerful network of scientists, government officials, and corporations working behind the scenes, prioritizing their own interests over public safety. He accuses them of deception, prioritizing profit over transparency, and engaging in activities that could have devastating consequences for the world. He suggests that the U.S. government's actions have not only been dishonest, but have also actively contributed to the potential for a global catastrophe. He concludes by highlighting the troubling connections between these individuals and their willingness to prioritize relationships with China over the safety and security of the United States. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a disturbing pattern of deception and dangerous scientific practices by the U.S. government, stretching back decades. He argues that the official story surrounding the origins of COVID-19 is a carefully constructed cover-up, designed to hide the U.S. government's deep involvement in risky research that may have inadvertently unleashed the pandemic. Kennedy Jr. asserts that the intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, had strong reasons to conceal the truth. Their fingerprints are all over the funding and development of the very research that could have led to the virus. The author explains that the U.S. government's involvement wasn't just about funding research. It was about actively promoting and even participating in the creation of dangerous viruses. He points to the CIA's financial support of the Wuhan Institute of Virology through organizations like USAID and EcoHealth Alliance, highlighting that over $64 million went towards gain-of-function research, experiments that modify viruses to make them more infectious or deadly. Kennedy Jr. emphasizes that this research wasn't a surprise. Preparations for managing a coronavirus pandemic were underway long before COVID-19 emerged, suggesting a level of foresight, or perhaps even planning, that is deeply unsettling. Kennedy Jr. details how the U.S. government, starting in the 1940s, secretly developed its own bioweapons program, defying international treaties. He claims that even after President Nixon ordered the program shut down, rogue elements within the CIA continued the work illegally. This history, he argues, created a culture where the line between defensive research and offensive bioweapons development became blurred. The author points to the anthrax attacks following 9/11 as evidence of this, suggesting that the attacks were used to justify a renewed bioweapons program and the passage of laws that shielded government officials from accountability. The narrative continues with Kennedy Jr.'s claim that the pandemic response itself was orchestrated with authoritarian control in mind, ignoring established public health protocols. He alleges that intelligence agencies deliberately suppressed information about the lab leak theory, even bribing members of their own investigation team to change their conclusions. A whistleblower revealed that 6 out of 7 investigators initially believed the virus originated from a lab leak, but were pressured to say they couldn't determine the origin. Kennedy Jr. further connects the CIA to EcoHealth Alliance, suggesting that the organization was recruited as an asset in 2015. He cites a former EcoHealth scientist, Andrew Huff, who claims Daszak, the president of EcoHealth, openly discussed working with the CIA to gather intelligence on Chinese labs. The author also highlights the involvement of British intelligence, noting connections between key figures in the cover-up and MI5, the UK's domestic intelligence agency. The author details how the US government, through agencies like the Department of Defense and NIAID, dramatically increased funding for gain-of-function research in China and other countries starting in 2014. This funding often flowed through EcoHealth Alliance, creating a network of interconnected interests. Kennedy Jr. argues that this funding wasn't just about scientific curiosity. It was about gaining access to potentially dangerous pathogens and understanding how to manipulate them. He points to a DARPA-funded program that secretly involved EcoHealth Alliance, despite official denials. Kennedy Jr. concludes by emphasizing the long history of the CIA, prioritizing power and control over transparency and accountability. He argues that the agency's involvement in the COVID-19 response is just the latest example of its willingness to deceive the American public and undermine democratic institutions. He suggests that the entire situation is driven by a cycle of fear and profit, where agencies and corporations benefit from creating and responding to pandemics. The author believes that the U.S. government's actions have created a dangerous situation, where the risk of future pandemics is significantly increased. Part 3: COVID-19 and the Cover-Up. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a disturbing story of hidden truths and dangerous science in this chapter, arguing that the U.S. government knowingly funded research that could have led to the COVID-19 pandemic. He claims decades of deception unfolded as top scientists, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, actively worked to downplay the possibility that the virus originated in a lab, despite privately believing it was likely. Kennedy Jr. asserts that Fauci and others engaged in a campaign of misinformation, silencing dissenting voices and manipulating the media to push a narrative of natural origin. The core of Kennedy Jr.'s argument centers on gain-of-function research, a scientific process that involves altering viruses to make them more infectious or deadly. He alleges that the National Institutes of Health, NIH, under Fauci's leadership, poured money into such research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, even as concerns about safety and potential risks were raised. He points to collaborations between American scientists like Ralph Baric and Chinese researchers like Xi Jinping, facilitated by Peter Daszak, as key to this dangerous undertaking. Kennedy Jr. explains that Baric developed techniques to create synthetic viruses and enhance their ability to infect human cells, and then shared this knowledge with the Wuhan lab. Kennedy Jr. emphasizes that this research wasn't simply about understanding viruses. It was about actively making them more dangerous. He cites specific studies funded by the NIH where scientists engineered viruses with enhanced transmissibility and virulence, essentially creating potential bioweapons. He argues that these experiments were conducted with insufficient safety measures, increasing the risk of accidental release. The author details how, despite a temporary pause on gain-of-function research ordered by President Obama, the work continued, with scientists finding loopholes and circumventing oversight. The author contends that the NIH deliberately ignored warnings and downplayed the risks, even when internal documents revealed the potential for creating highly infectious pathogens. He highlights instances where scientists expressed concerns about the research, only to be dismissed or silenced. Kennedy Jr. claims that Fauci repeatedly misled Congress and the public, denying that the NIH funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan, despite clear evidence to the contrary. He suggests that Fauci's actions were motivated by a desire to maintain control over the narrative and protect his reputation. Kennedy Jr. further alleges that the U.S. government's funding of this research wasn't limited to coronaviruses. He points to experiments involving the Nipah virus, a highly lethal pathogen, as evidence of a broader pattern of reckless bioweapons development. He expresses concern that scientists in Wuhan were using American funding and technology to create even more dangerous viruses, potentially with the ability to cause a far more devastating pandemic than COVID-19. The author concludes that the entire situation represents a massive betrayal of public trust and a dangerous gamble with global health. He believes a full accounting of these events is crucial to prevent similar disasters in the future. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a disturbing picture of decades of deception by the U.S. government, alongside a dramatic rise in dangerous bioweapons research. He argues that officials, particularly Dr. Anthony Fauci, knowingly funded and encouraged experiments that increased the risk of a pandemic, all while concealing the truth from the public. The author presents evidence suggesting that the U.S. government wasn't simply trying to understand viruses, but actively working to make them more dangerous through gain-of-function research, essentially, making viruses more easily spread or more deadly. Kennedy Jr. highlights a secret proposal by Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance to DARPA, the U.S. military's research agency. This proposal, submitted in 2018, outlined a plan to weaponize coronaviruses, even suggesting adding a specific component, a furin cleavage site, that makes viruses more infectious, a feature found in the COVID-19 virus. The author emphasizes the alarming nature of this plan, especially considering EcoHealth's financial struggles at the time, suggesting a desperate search for funding drove the risky proposal. DARPA rejected the plan, citing ethical and safety concerns, but Kennedy Jr. points out that NIH continued to fund Daszak's work for years. The author further reveals that Fauci's team also developed a technique to hide evidence of laboratory manipulation in viruses, a no-seum method, effectively erasing fingerprints from engineered pathogens. This, Kennedy Jr. argues, suggests a deliberate effort to avoid accountability if a lab-created virus were to escape. He notes that this technique was shared with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, raising concerns about its potential use in concealing the origins of COVID-19. Kennedy Jr. details how, despite warnings about safety issues at the Wuhan lab, the U.S. continued to fund research there. He cites U.S. diplomatic cables from 2018 that warned of inadequate safety protocols and a lack of oversight. The author contends that Fauci ignored these warnings, continuing to funnel money to the lab even as concerns grew about its ability to safely handle dangerous viruses. He points to the fact that the Wuhan lab was conducting gain-of-function research in lower security facilities, like BSL-2 and BSL-3 labs, which have far less stringent safety measures than the recommended BSL-4 level. The author also draws attention to the close ties between Fauci, Bill Gates, and pharmaceutical companies like Moderna. He highlights how Moderna received massive funding from the U.S. government, including from Fauci's NIH, to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, even before the pandemic began. Kennedy Jr. suggests this raises questions about potential conflicts of interest and whether the pandemic response was influenced by financial incentives. He notes that Moderna filed a patent application for its mRNA vaccine technology in early 2020, citing concerns about a possible deliberate release of a SARS coronavirus. Kennedy Jr. concludes by emphasizing the lack of transparency surrounding the origins of COVID-19 and Fauci's apparent unwillingness to investigate the possibility of a lab leak. He argues that the evidence suggests a deliberate effort to conceal the truth about the risks of gain-of-function research and the potential role of the Wuhan lab in the pandemic's emergence. The author frames this as a betrayal of public trust and a dangerous precedent for future biosecurity threats. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a disturbing pattern of deception and dangerous research. arguing that the COVID-19 pandemic wasn't a natural accident, but a consequence of decades of risky scientific practices and cover-ups. He asserts the U.S. government, alongside Chinese authorities, actively misled the public about the virus's origins, initially blaming a wet market in Wuhan, while evidence pointed to a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Kennedy Jr. highlights how early warnings from doctors in Wuhan were silenced, and crucial data about the virus was suppressed by Chinese officials, hindering the world's ability to respond effectively. The author emphasizes a long history of bioweapons development and gain-of-function research, altering viruses to make them more infectious or deadly, as central to the pandemic's origins. He points to the work of scientists like Shi Jingli at the Wuhan lab, funded in part by U.S. grants through Anthony Fauci, who were actively manipulating bat coronaviruses. Kennedy Jr. suggests this research wasn't simply about understanding viruses, but about making them more dangerous, potentially creating the very pathogen that caused the pandemic. He details how scientists involved attempted to downplay the lab leak theory and promote the natural origin story, even suppressing data that contradicted their narrative. Kennedy Jr. reveals a web of financial and professional connections between key figures in the U.S. and China, including Fauci, Peter Daszak, and George Gao, suggesting a coordinated effort to control the narrative surrounding the virus. He argues these individuals had a vested interest in protecting the gain-of-function research they had championed, and actively worked to discredit alternative theories about the virus's origins. The author points to instances of data deletion, censorship of dissenting voices, and the suppression of early warnings as evidence of a deliberate cover-up. The narrative details how the U.S. government, despite early intelligence suggesting a lab leak, initially downplayed the possibility and even resisted banning travel from China. Kennedy Jr. contends this was due to the influence of Fauci and his commitment to maintaining a collaborative relationship with Chinese scientists. He highlights the role of organizations like the World Health Organization, which he claims was complicit in the cover-up, accepting and promoting China's misleading information. Kennedy Jr. further illustrates the extent of the deception by detailing how scientists actively worked to hide evidence of their research, including removing viral databases and suppressing studies that contradicted the official narrative. He describes a pattern of silencing researchers who questioned the accepted story and the use of propaganda to shape public opinion. The author suggests that the pandemic wasn't just a public health crisis, but a demonstration of how powerful interests can manipulate science and information to serve their own agendas. He concludes that the events surrounding the pandemic reveal a dangerous trend of secrecy, reckless research, and a willingness to prioritize political and financial interests over public safety. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a disturbing story of hidden truths and dangerous science in these chapters. He argues that the U.S. government, along with powerful scientists and global elites, knowingly covered up the likely origins of the COVID-19 virus, a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. This cover-up, Kennedy Jr. claims, was decades in the making, built on a foundation of lies and a troubling increase in risky scientific research. The narrative begins with a warning issued by Jeremy Farrar, a key figure in the pandemic response, to investors in early 2020. Farrar, Kennedy Jr. asserts, shared inside information about the virus and potential countermeasures, allowing those with access to profit immensely. This early warning, the author suggests, was part of a larger pattern of exploiting the pandemic for financial gain. Farrar's influence, combined with connections to figures like Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates, gave him extraordinary power over global health policy. Kennedy Jr. paints a picture of SAGE, the UK's scientific advisory group, functioning almost as a governing body, with Farrar at the helm. A central theme is the decades-long rise of gain-of-function, research experiments that modify viruses to make them more infectious or deadly. Kennedy Jr. traces this back to the post-9/11 era, highlighting the role of Richard Hatchett, a key figure who advocated for aggressive, even authoritarian pandemic responses. Hatchett, the author explains, pushed for policies like lockdowns and mass vaccinations, strategies that were rehearsed in numerous simulations. These simulations, Kennedy Jr. argues, weren't about preparation, but about establishing a pre-planned response that benefited certain interests. The World Economic Forum, WEF, emerges as a crucial player in this story. Kennedy Jr. describes the WEF as a meeting place for billionaires and global leaders who promote a vision of centralized control, often at the expense of individual freedoms. He suggests that the WEF's Great Reset agenda, a plan for a new world order, was advanced through the pandemic response. The author points to the financial benefits enjoyed by companies like Amazon, Pfizer, and Google during the lockdowns as evidence of this agenda at work. Kennedy Jr. focuses on the suppression of evidence, suggesting the virus originated in a lab. He details how Chinese scientists initially suspected a lab leak, but quickly moved to promote the narrative of a natural origin. He highlights the story of Indian scientists who published a preprint study suggesting the virus was engineered, only to be pressured into retracting it by powerful figures like Fauci. Similarly, Chinese researchers who raised concerns about lab manipulation were silenced, and their work disappeared. The author reveals a secret teleconference call in February 2020 involving key scientists, including Farrar, Fauci, and Anderson. Kennedy Jr. claims that despite initial doubts about a natural origin, these scientists ultimately coordinated to publish a paper in Nature Medicine dismissing the lab leak theory. He presents evidence, through leaked emails, that this paper was heavily influenced by Fauci and Collins, and that the scientists downplayed their concerns to maintain funding and influence. The author argues that this coordinated effort was a deliberate attempt to mislead the public and protect the reputations of those involved in funding the risky research at the Wuhan lab. Kennedy Jr. concludes by emphasizing the dangerous implications of this cover-up. He suggests that the U.S. government's support for gain-of-function research, combined with a willingness to suppress dissenting voices, created a situation where a devastating pandemic became possible. He frames this as a betrayal of public trust and a threat to democratic values. The author's overall message is a call for transparency and accountability in the realm of public health and biosecurity. Robert Kennedy Jr. details a disturbing picture of how the U.S. government, along with powerful figures like Bill Gates and Dr. Anthony Fauci, actively worked to control the narrative surrounding the origins of COVID-19 and to prepare for a future of engineered pandemics. The author argues that decades of deception by these entities have been revealed, particularly concerning the dangerous practice of gain-of-function research and the increasing development of potential bioweapons. Kennedy Jr. asserts that the initial response to the virus wasn't about finding the truth, but about protecting those involved in risky scientific experiments. The narrative highlights how Fauci orchestrated a campaign to promote the idea that the virus came from natural causes, dismissing the possibility of a lab leak. This involved manipulating scientific organizations like the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, NASEM, and pressuring scientists to publish articles supporting this view. Kennedy Jr. points to secret meetings and emails as evidence of this coordinated effort, revealing how conflicted scientists were used to shape public opinion. He emphasizes that many of these scientists had financial ties to the very research that could have led to the pandemic. Kennedy Jr. explains that the U.S. government has been funding dangerous gain-of-function research for years, which involves modifying viruses to make them more infectious or deadly. This research, often conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, was funded by the National Institutes of Health, NIH, under Fauci's direction. The author contends that this research created the very risk it was supposed to prevent, and that the pandemic may have been a direct result of a lab accident. He details how Peter Daszak, a key figure in funding the Wuhan lab, actively worked to suppress any discussion of a lab leak, coordinating a group of scientists to publish articles dismissing the idea as a conspiracy theory. The author describes how Bill Gates leveraged his wealth and influence to control the global response to the pandemic. Gates had invested heavily in vaccine development and used his foundation to exert significant control over the World Health Organization, WHO. Kennedy Jr. argues that Gates's influence allowed him to push for policies that benefited his investments, such as lockdowns and mass vaccination campaigns, while suppressing alternative treatments. He points out that Gates's investments in companies like Moderna and BioNTech yielded enormous profits during the pandemic. Kennedy Jr. further details how the focus has shifted from responding to COVID-19 to preparing for future pandemics, a move he sees as a power grab by the same actors. He explains that organizations like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, are pushing for increased funding for pandemic preparedness, which will primarily benefit pharmaceutical companies and further centralize control over global health. The author suggests that this pandemic preparedness is a pretext for developing and deploying new technologies, including vaccines and surveillance systems that could be used for control and profit. He warns that this creates a cycle where engineered viruses could be deliberately released to justify further investment in these systems. The author concludes by expressing concern that the U.S. government and powerful organizations are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of perpetual pandemics, driven by financial incentives and a desire for control. He emphasizes the need for transparency and accountability, and warns against the dangers of allowing a small group of individuals to dictate global health policy. Kennedy Jr. believes that the public must be aware of these hidden agendas to protect their freedoms and health. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.